Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fourth virtual lunchtime lecture of the summer. I'm Rebecca McLean from the Oneida County History Center. Today, we are very excited to have Alexis Albright, curator at the Oriskany Museum in Oriskany, New York, to kind of share some new and old information about the Battle of Oriskany and Herkimers militia. And I know at the end she'll talk about it a little bit more, but she's working on a descendants project. Sounds very exciting. I'd also like to give a kind of shout out to both of our organizations to let everybody know that we are both open. We are taking research requests and researchers by appointment, and the Oriskany Museum is taking tours by appointment. So with that said, I'm going to pass over the microphone and the screen to Alexis, and enjoy, everybody.
Hello, everyone. As Rebecca said, my name is Alexis Albright. I'm the curator at the Oriskany Museum. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Oriskany Museum, we're about 3 miles from the battlefield on Route 69. We're right in the village on the Oriskany Creek, halfway between Utica and Rome. And also, as Rebecca said, we are open for tours by appointment. Our group size is limited to 8, but anyone can make a tour appointment by calling our number, which I'll give you at the end of the presentation. But we're all here this week because Thursday is the anniversary of the Battle of Oriskany, which happened just outside of the village here. And I'm here to give you a little bit of information about that, and also what we're doing as we look forward to the 250th anniversary of the battle in 2027. So without further ado, here we go. So when I say Battle of Oriskany, most of you are probably familiar with this picture. It's an oil painting by Frederick Yohn, painted around 1901, and it's in the collection of the Utica Public Library. Many of you may have been familiar with this when it was used as a postage stamp for the National Bicentennial. It was actually released in 1977 to commemorate the battle. This has become the iconic image of General Herkimer and the Battle of Oriskany. So what do we know just from the barest facts about the battle? It was fought on August 6, 1777. It was a Wednesday morning. It's August in central New York, so it was warm and humid. The men were on their 3rd day of marching by the time the battle broke out. They'd left around Little Falls that Monday. And they're following an old military road through swampy, wooded land. We think about the Utica Marsh and the Oriskany Flats, and that's where most of where they're marching. So on a larger scale, what was happening in the summer of 1777? Well, for the British, it was known as the Burgoyne Campaign. It was named for Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, who was a British officer that designed a plan to bring a 3-pronged attack to separate the colonies. For the Americans, it's come to be known as the Saratoga Campaign. And overall, the campaign became an American victory, and Burgoyne surrendered and returned to England. But what happened between planning the campaign, the Battle of Oriskany, and the Burgoyne surrender? So the idea was that if Britain could separate New England from the rest of the colonies, it would cut off supply and information, and hopefully help cripple the colonies to the point that the British would be able to win the war. So Burgoyne devised that they would send his own forces down from Montreal. He'd send another officer by the name of Barry St. Ledger down up the St. Lawrence into Lake Ontario, across to Oneida Lake, and through the Mohawk Valley to eventually meet him at Albany. They also sent dispatch to New York to have an Albany sent up from British-occupied New York City. What they didn't count on was that St. Ledger's forces were going to be turned away at the Battle of Oriskany. So to give you an inset on this map, you can see Albany and Oneida Lake. You can see Fort Dayton, which was near Herkimer. And you can see the Battle of Oriskany. And I'll give you just a second to look at that map, and I'll stop my phone ringing. as you can see, there's a lot that happened in the summer of 1777. And Oriskany is just a small part of that. But what happened really changed the western front of the Burgoyne Campaign. So what did Herkimer's world look like? We're lucky. Well, first of all, who was General Herkimer? General Herkimer was in charge of the Tryon County Militia. He was a brigadier general, and he had about 800 militiamen in his charge by the time of August 1777. This is what his world looked like. You have Herkimer Home, which still stands. That was built by the Herkimer family in 1764. It's still near Little Falls. And we also have Fort Herkimer Church, which was built in 1767 and expanded in 1812. So in the lead up to the battle, Herkimer issued a proclamation in July 1777 that his militia should stand ready. By July 30th, the Oneida are warning Herkimer that the British are about 4 days out from Fort Stanwix, which is about 60 miles west of where Herkimer is, and Herkimer issues a call to arms. By Monday, August 4th, the militia is going to depart Fort Herkimer near Fort Herkimer Church. Now, they're anticipating a 3-day march to Fort Stanwix. They're not sure if the British are already there. They know that if the British are, the fort's going to have trouble getting men and supplies in and out. So Herkimer's coming with 800 men and supplies to relieve Fort Stanwix. Strip it down to the bare facts. Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer has about 800 Patriot soldiers with the Tryon County Militia. The first day they march as far as Utica, which was then the old Fort Schuyler, which had been used during the French and Indian War. Relative location is near Baggs Square in present-day Utica. The next day they march to the Oneida village of Oriskany. They camp here just about where the museum is today, near where the Oneida village was settled, which is at the confluence of the Mohawk River and the Oriskany Creek. From here, 60 to 100 Oneida warriors joined the Americans on the march to Fort Stanwix. Sitting outside of Fort Stanwix is the British forces. They were primarily Loyalist soldiers. There were also Hessian mercenaries, Loyalist colonists, and Native allies from the Mohawk and Seneca tribes. So as the militia departs Fort Herkimer and then Old Fort Schuyler, and they reach the Oneida village, they get ready to depart for Fort Stanwix on Wednesday morning. Herkimer had sent messengers ahead to Fort Stanwix, but by that morning they had not returned. They were supposed to hear cannon volley when the message was received. The officers pressed Herkimer to move. He wasn't sure about moving until they heard what the status of the British forces was, what the status of the fort was. But his officers come forward and accuse him of having divided loyalties because his brother is with the Loyalists. The army decides to move forward and walks into an ambush. This painting, which is behind me as well, was done during the Great Depression and shows the military road with the wagons of supplies and the militiamen. You can tell some of them have uniforms, some of them don't. It would have been a ragtag bunch. This is not a regular army. This was commissioned around 2008 and shows the Oneidas at the Battle of Oriskany. So as the men and supplies start the last leg of the journey through what is today the battlefield to Fort Stanwix, they're going through a gully, a ravine. What they don't know is that the British are lying in wait for them. As the train of soldiers walks through, before they're fully into the ravine, the British line starts firing upon them and chaos breaks loose, which is what you see here. In some areas, it came down to hand-to-hand fighting. At the end of the line, the men started to disperse, not knowing what was going on. And eventually, the fighting stretched over a mile, if not longer, as it became a very individualized battle. At the start of it, Herkimer on his white horse is shot through the leg, killing the horse. They bring General Herkimer under a tree at the edge of the fighting, where he continues to command his men. In the middle of the fighting, it starts to rain, a storm breaks out, and the Patriots regroup. The British also start to regroup. In the meantime, there is forces from Fort Stanwix realizing that from the messengers that have just gotten there, what's happening. They realize that the British camp is now empty, and they start what's called Willet's Sortie, in which they start to raid the British camp. Word gets up to the British lines, and eventually the British leave the battlefield, leaving the Americans to regroup and retreat. Well, eventually both armies retreated. The Patriots started back to Little Falls with a wounded Herkimer. The back part of their line had left or was fighting a mile or so from the front lines. In all, out of the 800 to 900 troops following the American cause, they suffered about 50% casualties between the wounded and the dead. The British went in with about 450 men, possibly more, and they took about 15% casualties. So we're back to that iconic image. And if any of you have spent time at the Utica Public Library, you may have seen this in person. Herkimer continued to command his men, but now he's injured. Eventually, they bring him back to his house, which of course is still 3 days march. He is seen by a surgeon. They take his leg, but he suffers from the infection and dies about a week later. The spot where Herkimer commanded his men is still visible on the battlefield. The original tree is not there, but this is approximately the view of the monument from where Herkimer sat during the battle. And the monument is about where the men regrouped. So, one of the things that is fascinating to me is the amount of information that is coming back into public view as historical resources are coming online. And one of those things is in the Founding Fathers papers. We can see the information transmitting across the desks of all of these names we recognize. So here we have what is one of the first descriptions of the battle, and a letter from General Philip Schuyler, who was in charge of military in New York, to John Hancock. And this is written in Albany on August 6, 1770, or August 8th, 1777, only 2 days after the battle. He says, at 6 this morning, an express arrived from Tryon County advising me that General Herkimer marched on the 3rd instant to support the garrison at Fort Schuyler, which was Fort Stanwix, which had been renamed after Schuyler because Stanwix had been a British name for the fort, and when the Americans occupied it, they wanted an American name. That on Wednesday, between Oriskany and the fort, the militia were attacked, and according to the information received, entirely cut to pieces. The general killed with most of the field officers. The number of the enemy that made the attack is no wise ascertained, but are thought to be very numerous. The fort, by all the accounts received, was attacked before the militia marched, but with what manner we know not. Whether by Indian firing with small arms at a distance to confine our people within the fort, or whether their main body was near advanced or not, I cannot say. Therefore hope you will immediately send assistance, or this quarter must of course fall into the enemy's hands, as the whole of the militia was in the engagement, except a few guards that were stationed in different places. So this has really wakened Schuyler up to the conditions on New York's Western Front. He'd originally been hesitant to send troops, and now it looks like he might have to. We also see it go across John Adams' desk. We have confused hints that an attack was made upon Fort Schuyler and the enemy repulsed. The letter seems to suppose that he had written a fuller account of it, but no such account has reached us. And this is over a week after the battle. Finally, it ends up on George Washington's desk. A party detached from Fort Schuyler made several prisoners and took a good deal of baggage and 4 royals. This is an interesting event and in all probability will prevent another invasion in that quarter this campaign. They had suffered before in an action with Brigadier Herkimer at the head of part of the militia of Tryon County, who behaved with the greatest spirit and bravery. As the sign at the battlefield says, the Battle of Oriskany was not quickly forgotten in the Mohawk Valley. Most people in Tryon County knew someone or had a family member that was at the battle, if not injured or killed in the battle. On the sign, it's many a longer year before the sorrow and suffering caused by the sacrifices at Oriskany had been forgotten in the Valley of the Mohawk. And we see that show up in one of the earliest histories of our area, which is the Annals and the Recollections of Oneida County by Pomeroy Jones. And in 1851, he recalls going to the battlefield as a child in 1797. And he says that many of the trees from the ground to the height of 20 or 30 feet were so perforated with balls, musket balls, that they had the appearance of a building that would be battered by a hailstorm. When Schuyler did finally arrange to have additional troops sent west after St. Leger's British forces, he sent a group under the command of Benedict Arnold. And when they passed the battlefield, it was entirely grisly, and they were in charge of burying the dead and also going after St. Leger's forces. They still weren't sure the size of the force, and Benedict Arnold ended up projecting through some maneuvering of his own that he was coming with a bigger force than he was, which eventually forced the British west. As far as the Burgoyne Campaign was concerned, the Americans started retreating down the Hudson Valley towards Albany, but finally stood at Saratoga. Burgoyne was forced to surrender that fall. The British never took Albany. St. Leger's forces went north, and troops never came from New York City. They were on business of their own. So, aside from Pomeroy Jones visiting the battlefield in 1797 with his uncle, the battle starts to fade a bit. New things are coming through, the Erie Canal, history from Mohawk Valley. But finally, as we entered the centennial of the country and the 100th anniversary of the battle, a group was organized to commemorate the battlefield. Parts of it had since been used as farmland, but the land was purchased and funds were gathered to put a marker on the field. The monument is built partially of reclaimed stone from the Erie Canal, and a lot of it was organized by what became the Oneida County History Center today. In the spring of 1877 is when they began the campaign to get this project done, and the monument was finally dedicated on August 6th, 1884. It's exactly where it is today. You can see the tree cover is not then what it is now. If you've never been to the site, it's part of the New York State Parks system. So it is open during the pandemic. People are allowed to go up there. You're allowed to walk the trails. And there's signage telling you which area of the battlefield that you're on. Looking forward, we're already starting to plan for the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Oriskany, which will be commemorated on August 6th, 2027. If you or someone you know is descended from Herkimers militia, their Oneida allies, or members of Herkimer's household, including the dozen or so slaves that worked on the property, we'd like to hear from you. We can help you with research if you don't know. Also, if your family has been in the Mohawk Valley for a long time, you might have connections to this. A lot of people that don't know their ancestry, it's because they've been here so long. And there's many resources, many of them free, available online for you to start to learn about your family's connection to the local area, or just to learn about Herkimer's militia in general. One of the records that's available online now is Federal Revolutionary War pensions, which were issued towards veterans of the Revolutionary conflict. But part of the application process was that they needed to give account of who they served under, where they served, and what their experience was. And sometimes these soldiers attested to it themselves. Sometimes it was done by their widow or children. But with 800 men under Herkimer, that means there's 800 different stories and potentially 800 different pension applications. So if you think that your family is tied to the battle and you want to go looking, we'd love to hear from you. It takes a lot to go through 800 pension files, and if each family does it themselves, we'll have a clearer picture of who was in Herkimer's militia, what their personal experiences were, and what life was like after the battle in the Mohawk Valley. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions.